Chapter 23. Rosala led the way through the streets of Malian's Gate. As before, the inhabitants gave her a wide berth. Clearly, she was known to be an emissary of the Medusa, and Dane wondered what she had done to earn her place in his band. It was still difficult to take her seriously. Half the time, she was skipping through the streets, and the other half, she was singing nonsense songs in Goblin. But having seen her at the brawl, Dane wondered how much of this was part of her pose. They passed a group of goblins painting gargoyle silhouettes onto strips of gray cloth. "It's for 8 wins," Rosala explained, tapping a band of gray cloth wrapped around her wrist. "Karalag will win this year. Wait and see." Jode was cheerful as always, and he chattered away with the girl, discussing the race of 8 wins, and the history of the bat and the gargoyle. But Dane was still frustrated by his encounter with the Medusa, and he had no interest in hearing the tricks the gargoyle might use against the griffin or Pegasus. This fire still burned when they reached the gates of the district, and he nodded curtly to the goblin and headed off to the streets of Old Keep. Without speaking to the others, he led them into the first tavern he saw, a grimy dive with an upside-down griffin above the door. "Do you still have any silver?" he growled to Jode. Jode threw him a sovereign. Dane slapped the coin down on the bar. "I don't care what it is, as long as it's strong," he said. The bartender grunted, and Dane turned and made his way to a filthy table. The others followed him. Jode and Lay sat down. Pierce continued to stand. Being made of steel, stone, and wood, he was immune to the effects of fatigue, and he generally preferred to remain ready for action. Having studied their surroundings, Pierce held his flail in one hand. The chain was still wrapped around the haft, but clearly he felt that it was best to be prepared. "You're in a charming mood today," Jode said to Dane. "I expected you to be interested in the aerial archery discussion. It sounds like we could have used a squad of gargoyle archers a year ago." "But we didn't have any, did we? And now all those soldiers are dead." The bartender brought over a few mugs filled with some foul Marcher brew. Dane took a deep swallow. Lay sniffed her mug and pushed it away. "And this is news?" Jode said. "I would hope that there's something more recent bringing you down." "Fine." Dane drained his mug in one long draught, then slammed it down on the table. He took Lay's rejected flagon. "Why are we doing this? Why are we here?" "On Eberron?" Dane glared at him. "In Sharn, working for Alina, talking about weather and wind with thrice-damned goblin thieves." "Oh, Rosala's a good girl. Reminds me of myself at that age." Joe took a sip and winced. "Except for the orange skin, of course. But really, Dane, where else would we be? Seer isn't coming back, and there are probably as many Seerans in Sharn as there are anywhere else in Corvair. Working for Alina, where else can we make that kind of money? If you don't like it, then do something to help the refugees. Give them the money we get from Alina. I'm sure Greykill could put it to good use. Or, here's an idea. Figure out who's turning Syrian refugees into monsters and do something about it. Crazy, Dane looked down into the drink and scowled. "And what's Alina got to do with this?" Jode nodded. This is about your family, isn't it?" Lay had been studying the grimy patrons of the tavern, but at this she looked up. "What do you mean?" "Quiet, Jode," Dane growled.
You heard what the Sphinx said about your past? I think she had a point.
What are you talking about?
Lay said.
I don't think Dane's ready to talk about it,
Jode said.
Let's just say that we've crossed paths sometime before we joined the army. And there are some issues I think our captain needs to deal with.
Lay looked over at Dane, but he just scowled.
Look, she said. I don't care what this is about, but we don't have anywhere else to go. You know what? I'd like to live in a place that isn't filled with lice. And do you think I like that gruel just because I can make it? This isn't how I expected to live my life. The future I should have had has been stolen from me as well. So get over it. Let's do what we need to do to get this gold. If you want to give your share to the refugees, then do so. Seer wasn't my home, and I don't have a family anymore. And I'm sick of suffering for both of them.
Behind them, Pierce remained silent and still.
I see it's good moods all around, Jode said. The joy at this table is overwhelming. But you're right. We won't get anything accomplished by drinking except to pour away what little money we have. So, what more do we have to work with?
Dane closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Jode was right, of course. Fine. We have the freaks in high walls who appear to have been created through magic, I assume. Perhaps it's voluntary, perhaps not, and a changeling is involved.
I doubt that means anything, Lay said. There's no huge changeling conspiracy. It's easy to mistrust them, but changelings are individuals just like us. They aren't some faceless mob.
Except for the part about being faceless,
Jode pointed out.
And how can you be so certain there's no conspiracy? Unless you're a changeling.
Lay glared at him.
As I recall, you were the one who said changelings weren't inherently evil.
Jode shrugged.
Just taking the side of the traveler. Are you sure it was me you were talking to this morning?
Dane opened his eyes. Shut up, Jode. We know 3 things about the freaks we fought last night. One was a changeling, another had received her gift within the last few weeks, and there's a good chance they had some sort of dealing with our friend Raciel.
All true,
Jode said. What we don't know is what Raciel would be doing with a group of monster makers. He drained the last of his drink and stood up. Drink up! We're going to talk to Alina. Jode eyed the mug.
I think I'll pass on the drink. I'd just as soon be on my toes when talking with her.
Suit yourself. Do you suppose we need to make an appointment? Dane said as the lift pulled up to Denias.
I'm sure she already knows we're coming,
Jode said. If she knows so much, what does she need us for, anyway?
An excellent question.
Is there anything more I should know about meeting this Alina?
Lay's curiosity had overcome her general malaise, and it was hard to stay gloomy amidst the pleasant surroundings of the gnome enclave.
She likes to play games, Jode said. If she talks to you, bear that in mind. She'll try to provoke you, and she'll pretend to know more than she does.
Why?
Jode shrugged.
It's part of Zeal culture. The gnomes have always fought with words instead of swords. The more she knows about you, how you react, how she can manipulate you, the stronger her precision.
Better not speak at all, Dane said. Lay nodded.
Is she dangerous?
Who isn't? Dane thought, remembering her description of Ratio. Without question, he said, she's extremely wealthy, and you can be certain she has wards and other magical defenses spread around her lair.
And bodyguards,
I imagine,
Jode put in.
Alina likes bodyguards.
Lay shot Dane an inquiring glance, and he took a deep breath before continuing. She's a wizard of some talent, though I couldn't tell you exactly how powerful she is. Just be careful. Don't push her.
I wasn't planning on it.
Good. The gnome gardener smiled and bowed courteously at their approach, and a moment later, the secret passage beneath the garden stood revealed. Lady Lyris is expecting you, he said.
See?
Said Jode. Dane shook his head. They descended through the passage and soon found themselves in the mirrored room. Dane noticed that the long window now displayed an entirely different view than it had before. Unless his eyes deceived him, they were looking down over Malian's gate. Alina stood by the window, a golden spyglass in her hand. Today, she wore a gown of green and gold, the patterns of which bore an uncanny resemblance to Lay's heirloom armor. She turned toward them with a brilliant smile.
Welcome back, Dane. Jode. She made a sweeping gesture. Please, sit.
She walked over to Lay and looked up at her. Dane always forgot just how small Alina actually was.
I am Alina Loridan Lyris, and you must be Lady Canith. Just Lay. Of course. My apologies. A cup of blackroot tal, perhaps?
Leave her alone, Alina, Dane said. We came here for a reason.
You've run out of money.
That too,
said Jode.
I'm listening.
I don't know what sort of game you're playing. You obviously know more than we do. It's hard to imagine that you couldn't find Ratio without us. Alina looked back out the window.
I know it's hard to believe, but my powers are limited.
Dane shot a glance at Jode. Such an admission of weakness was very uncharacteristic of her, and thus highly suspect.
I believe that you've already encountered other members of House Tarkanan?
Yes. So, did you know about Ratio's connection to the Tarkanans?
Of course.
She turned to face him and tapped her hand.
I told you not to let Ratio touch you, if you recall. That's why I haven't been able to employ my usual resources. The balance of power in the city is shifting. There are a number of old established forces that have been part of Sharn since the first towers were built, but new powers have arrived in the wake of the war, myself among them. Now it is a game of alliance and subterfuge, to see if the newcomers can set roots and dislodge the old, established trees.
I never thought of you as a gardener, Alina.
I have a knack for making things grow. You of all people should know that.
And where do the Tarkanans fit into your garden?
At the moment, the Tarkanans have remained neutral in this struggle. I doubt they would be pleased to know that Ratio had been working for me. But even so, if something had to be done about him, I didn't want it to be traced back to me. I can't afford to have the Tarkanans as enemies. Yet.
Why didn't you mention this before?
There are things I simply can't say, Dane.
Dane was surprised to see Jode's shocked expression. This was more or less what he'd expected Alina to say.
I knew you'd encounter the Tarkanans, Alina continued. The less you knew about the situation, the more natural your reaction would be, and the less chance of their recognizing the connection. At this point, I think you're safe enough from them. You made quite an impression.
So what about our freakish friends in high walls? Do you know anything about that?
You know that I hate to admit my own limitations, but until yesterday, I knew nothing whatsoever. I have a few contacts in high walls, so I've heard about the corpses. Do you know why you were attacked?
Was she telling the truth? Dane wondered. Alina was unreadable as always. Her features might as well have been carved from white marble. I had hoped that you would tell us, Dane said. I think your friend Raciel had dealings with them.
Ah,
Indeed. You know more about your stolen shards than we do, and more about magic than I ever will. Do you have any idea why a cackling changeling and a woman with a new eye on her hand would want your shards? Alina paused, her eyes distant. She sat down and reached behind her chair, producing a glass of shimmering light. She took a thoughtful sip.
I don't know.
Really? Or is this another one of those things you can't say? Alina looked up at him, her eyes cold and hard. Dane held up a hand in apology. Remember who you're dealing with. I'm sorry. It's been a long day, and we're barely at the first bell. But we're running out of leads, Alina. Anything would help. She nodded.
I don't know, but it's possible. The dragon shards are ideally suited to hold certain types of magical energy. In theory, if you charged the stone, then ground it to powder, and infused it into a liquid form. That's exactly what I was thinking,
Lay said. Alina glanced at her and she looked away.
I can't say exactly what would happen, said Alina. I've never acquired stones of this caliber before, which is why I was trying to acquire this batch. But in theory, if you were trying to induce a magical transformation and you weren't concerned with the possible side effects on these subjects, yes, the shards might be extremely valuable to your monster makers.
Dane nodded. So, what are they worth? How much do you think they paid Raciel?
You've worked with me before, Dane. I think that Raciel knows better than to cross me for something so petty as gold.
He was willing to cross the Tarkanians to work with you,
Jode commented.
True, but I don't think Raciel has ever really seen himself as a Tarkanan. They base their membership on those miserable dragon marks, and Raciel hates his mark, useful as it is. They may punish him for working behind their backs, but they won't kill him or do anything worse. Now, our relationship. As I said, he wouldn't betray me for money.
It's possible they have some sort of leverage over him, that he didn't have a choice in the matter. If they are interested in the shards, I'd say the odds are good that he's already passed them along.
Agreed.
Alina swirled the light liquid about in her long glass.
Raciel is a secondary concern, Dane. I want my shards back. If you are correct, and these makers of monsters already have the shards, I want to know what they plan to do with them. Or what they've already done. That is what I'm paying 400 dragons for. The shards themselves, or whatever is left of them, Racial, can rot.
Any ideas on where to look? Our leads came to nothing.
Jode looked thoughtful, but it was Alina who eventually spoke. You're sure that the people who attacked you were all Sirens?
Absolutely. Well, except for the changeling.
Alina pondered. Whoever is making these aberrations would need to include space for the patient to recover, not to mention binding tables, and a system to preserve living elements. You couldn't do this in a tent or a single room. If your people really are operating out of high walls, I would think the only place they'd be able to fit such a workplace would be down below, in the cogs.
What might we expect to run into if we find more of them?
I couldn't say. The basilisk eye is quite ingenious. I've never met anyone who could accomplish such a transfer. If that level of skill can be relied upon, well, a harpy would be a good source of wings, and perhaps you could even find a way to steal its voice. The breath of a dragon, a unicorn's horn, the shroud of a displacer beast. A fascinating concept, really. They say changelings are the children of humans and doppelgangers. Can you be certain your changeling was born that way?
Lei frowned.
It's possible, but I still don't see. You are from the house of making, Lady Decanith. You weave magic into stone and metal. Your enemy, our enemy, seems to do the same with flesh and bone. You may wish to find out why, how, and who, and I might pay you for this information. If there is a new player on the board, I should wish to know about it, and all the more reason for using you, my outsiders. But for now, I want my dragon shards. I suggest you act quickly. If these people are performing magical experiments, it may be too late to recover them. She produced a small purse, which she threw at Jode. I think you'd better keep this one, Jode. The halfling nodded. Now please, get on with it. Time is running out.
She walked over to one of the mirrors. A moment later, she passed through and disappeared.
She didn't seem so bad, Lee said. A gnomish child ran past them, twirling a hoop of cold fire.
Did you notice the new bird? The purple one? Dane remarked to Jode. Jode nodded.
Eberron nutcatcher, I think. Very exotic.
So? Said Lei.
Oh, nothing.
There's something I need to do,
Jode said, and Dane was surprised by his serious tone.
I had a thought while I was listening to Alina, and, well, it's something I need to do alone. I'll meet you at the Manticore at the third bell.
No, said Dane. It's not safe, especially if those things were after you.
What's on your mind?
Jode shook his head.
This is something I need to do myself. You need to trust me.
Trust isn't the issue.
After all we've been through, you know I can handle myself alone. I'll stay out of sight.
We don't know how many more of these freaks are out there, what they look like, or what they can do. I'm sorry, Jode, but...
Daisy! Lei shouted. A moment later, she was running through the crowd.
Ugh, Delore! Dane cursed. Come on, quickly!
He dove through the crowd after her. As he ran, he slipped his dagger out of its sheath, holding the blade close against his forearm. Daisy Decanith!
Lei called, still running. She came to a small plaza and grabbed hold of a woman in a green robe, her short red hair partially hidden by a headdress of gold and silk.
Daisy! Think, Olandra. You don't know how glad I am to see you.
The woman turned to face Lei, and her face was cold. It was just then that Dane noticed. Pierce had followed him, but Jode was nowhere to be seen. Chapter 24. Dane turned to Pierce. Find Jode, quickly! If you can't, head back to the Manticore, and we'll see you there. Pierce sprinted away, and Dane turned his attention back to Lei and the stranger. She was slightly younger than Lei, and there was no questioning her wealth. Her beautiful green gown was made from Zil Dream's silk, sprinkled with gold and platinum threads that recalled the patterns of the stars in the sky. A rainbow of gems adorned her golden headdress, scattering the light into 1,000 shards. She was staring disdainfully at Lei, and she did not speak. Then Lei hit her. This was no elegant slap. Lei had been in the battlefield for years, and although she was part of the support corps, she'd been in more than one brawl. The blow caught Daisy completely by surprise. The woman staggered back, nearly knocking over a display of fine hats. A stream of blood trickled from her nose, and her eyes were full of fury. Rising again, she reached into one of her billowing sleeves and produced a crystal-tipped wand of black oak and leveled the slender rod at Lei. Dane knew he couldn't reach Daisy in time to stop her from releasing the spell, but he charged anyway. Better late than never. He needn't have worried. In the split second it had taken Daisy to draw the wand, Lei was already in motion, spinning the dark wood staff. A low, sweeping blow caught Daisy just behind her left knee. She howled in pain and collapsed. A second blow smashed her hand and sent the wand flying. Dane snatched it out of the air and tucked it into his belt. Lei stood over the fallen woman, the dark wood staff leveled at her throat. Surely it was a trick of the light, but it seemed to Dane that the face carved into the shaft of the staff was smiling a little wider than usual. Lei's expression was grim. Lei, what are you doing? He said.
Stay out of this, Dane.
Her opponent glared at Lei from the ground, clutching her bruised fingers.
I have endured more pain in the last 3 days than you have in your entire life, Daisy.
Lei flicked her staff toward Daisy's face, pulling back at the last minute. The injured woman flinched and cried out.
Perhaps it's time to change that.
Lei, said Dane, and he took a careful step forward. Was it the staff making Lei act this way? Could it have done something to her?
I said stay out of this,
she snapped. She set the tip of her staff against Daisy's throat.
I'm adapting. I'll survive. But to have you, not even speak to me.
She pressed on Daisy's throat, pushing her back.
If you think I'll put up with that, you don't know me as well as I thought.
She drew back the staff, and the woman gasped.
Now, let's try this again. Daisy DeCaneth. You don't know how glad I am to see you.
For a moment, Daisy held Lei's gaze, and Dane could see the same fire in her eyes that he'd seen in Lei so many times before. Then it went out, and she looked down at the ground.
You shouldn't be here, Lei. Just go. And where should I go, cousin? The lure, for all I care.
Daisy glared up at her.
You're not my cousin anymore. You have no place in family or Sharn. I think that I can live with two of those three.
Lay's voice was calmer, and she lowered the staff.
But I just as soon our final conversation didn't end in the street.
She held out her hand.
Get up. Surely you can find it in your heart to buy a last meal for your departing cousin.
Daisy said nothing, but she took the hand and let Lay pull her to her feet.
Lead on, said Lay, as this may be my last meal with a member of House Cannith. I'll trust to your generosity.
As Daisy led them to a water-house, Lay looked back at Dane.
Where are Pierce and Jode?
Jode vanished on some errand. I sent Pierce after him. What's going on here? He nodded toward Daisy. That was a rather surprising display back there.
As I recall, you're the one who throws dwarves off lifts. I'm not allowed to express my anger?
It didn't seem like you. Lay looked down at the ground for a moment.
I know. I shouldn't have hit her. It's just, after our history, I couldn't believe she was standing by this excoriate claim.
She shook her head and smiled slightly.
Did you see her expression when she hit the ground? I may have lost my family fortune, but that's a memory I'll treasure.
Dane chuckled and slid his dagger back into its sheath. There is that. And for speaking of priceless, it looks like it's time for lunch. The waterhouse drew a wealthy crowd. At a table in the corner, a Mrorian banker was entertaining a group of dwarves and gnome merchants with a colorful story about the relative values of sovereigns, crowns, and golden gallifars, and a burst of laughter echoed throughout the room. Dane sniffed his mug. Gnomes. It's one thing to have the innkeeper water down the ale, but only a gnome could get people to pay even more for straight water. Daisy rolled her eyes.
It's not just water, they explained. It's infused with various herbs, and the mug itself is made from fragrant clay to add to the overall aesthetic experience.
Right. So our little friends say. But have you tried it yet? He took a long pull. If you ask me, you're paying good gold for water in a smelly mug. Lay shrugged.
Which is why Daisy is paying. So, cousin, are you ready to talk?
There were daggers in Daisy's stare, but she had regained her composure.
If I'm not, do you plan to start another brawl? Is that why you chose a restaurant where they hold weapons at the door?
Daisy looked away. Lay looked down at the table.
Days, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done it. But the last few days have been very difficult. Put yourself in my position. How can I? How can I? This whole mess is still a mystery to me. What have I done to deserve this?
Daisy's expression softened.
You mean you really don't know? Why would I lie? I've been fighting in the war for the last 3 years. I spent the last 5 months digging through the wreckage of my homeland. It's been over half a year since I've even seen another member of the house. And he was just a supply courier. How could I have betrayed the house? When could I have done it?
Their meals arrived, drifting through the air in the hands of an invisible servitor. Dane had been dreaming about a bloody piece of meat. But it turned out that the specialty of the Waterhouse was bread, which was just as exotic and carefully prepared as the water.
I don't know, said Daisy. You weren't the only one to be ousted, and I didn't press for details. These last few months have been difficult for everyone. I think my difficult tops your difficult. You don't understand.
Daisy drained her mug and set it down hard. A moment later, it was snatched away by an invisible servant.
You grew up in Seir. Metrol was the heart of the house, and it was the council that held us all together. These last few months, it's been chaos, Lay. Supply lines have been shattered. Business is uncertain. They're saying that the Council of Thronehold may outlaw the use of Warforged, or at least their creation. Half the barons want to lead the next council, while the other half don't even want to council. There's been hoarding of goods and materials, even some talk of sabotage within the house. What's this have to do with me? Merrick's is one of the aspiring leaders. He's been trying to purge the house. He says he's removing traitors and enemies of the house, but he may just be flexing his muscles. I still don't understand. How am I an enemy of the house? Doesn't he have to justify this to someone?
Daisy nodded.
He had to explain his case to the regional arbiters. Yes, I don't know the answer, but I do have a little information you may not have. Among other things, you're not the only person he's driven from that house. I'd gathered that. What you may not know is that two of the others he excoriated were your parents, Elisa and Talon. What? But they're dead. Apparently, he's not taking any chances. Perhaps your fate is linked to theirs. He may have simply accused your entire family.
Lay finished her water and slammed the mug down on the table. Dane was surprised that it survived the experience. Looking around, she grabbed his half-full mug and took another swallow. Dane put his hand on her shoulder. "Blaming the dead is always easier than challenging the living," he said gently. "It sounds to me like this Merrick's is just trying to make the best of a bad situation, and he's willing to sacrifice the memory of your family to improve his own situation." Lay blinked back tears, but her voice was steady.
What were they accused of, Daisy? I don't know. I told you. They only gave names, not reasons. With all the upheaval, it didn't seem like the time to ask questions. Although...
She shifted uncomfortably, rubbing her bruised fingers.
What? You're not going to hit me again, are you? What were you going to say? Do you know what happened at Seir? I told you we spent the last 6 months there. I've seen it. It's more disturbing than you can imagine.
And so I've heard. Daisy looked around and lowered her voice.
But what I meant was, do you know what caused it? Does anyone? That's the question of the hour. A lot of people are blaming House Cannith. It's common knowledge that the house had a strong presence in the region, and the Maidrites and Sages are still trying to make sense of it. I don't know for certain, but I think that Baron Merrick's had claimed that your family was involved in some way.
Lay leaped to her feet, and her chair crashed to the floor. Dane was up and had grabbed her arm before she had a chance to strike the blow.
I'm just telling you what I heard. Daisy cringed against her seat.
The fire in her eyes had gone out again. Lay pulled against Dane's arm, but he held fast. She stopped and took a deep breath. Closing her eyes, she exhaled slowly, then opened her eyes again. Dane let go of her arm.
I take it you weren't involved in the morning then, Daisy said. I was there. It's a miracle I survived at all. And even I don't know what happened. So, how can you be certain that your parents...
Dane grabbed Lay's arm again before she could wind back for another blow. Daisy raised her hands defensively.
Look, Lay, I'm not saying that they did anything wrong. I'm just asking.
I think you've said enough, Lady Decaneth. Dane pulled Lay out of the chair. I thank you for the... He gestured at the remnants of bread and water. Meal. But I think we should go our separate ways now. Daisy nodded, and her relief was easy to see.
I'll settle the cost.
Lay seemed calm, but Dane kept hold of her hand. Shall we depart, my lady? Lay whirled her staff and struck at the air, venting her anger on flies and shadows. While he'd sooner have seen her happy, Dane actually preferred the angry Lay to the distant, emotionally drained Lay he'd been living with the last few days. She was only repeating what she'd heard, Dane said.
I know. It just makes me angry. How could anyone think that they, could do such a horrible thing?
Someone did it.
Really?
She stopped and turned to face him.
Then why haven't they done it again? There's nothing to prove that any human agency was involved. Perhaps some sort of epic conjunction of the planes opened a gateway to Kirthri.
Covering an entire nation?
Well, we don't know, do we? You used to follow the Silver Flame, right? How do you know it wasn't the work of one of those fiends bound by the flame?
Maybe because they're bound by the flame? She glared at him.
You know what I'm saying? There's nothing proving that humans had anything to do with it, let alone House Cannith. And certainly not my parents.
Well... Dane began walking again. Lay followed on his heels.
Well, what?
Do you remember our last battle at Kelden Ridge?
How could I forget?
We never did find out who those Forged were fighting for.
And so?
Oh, come on, Lay. An army of strange Warforged? You know as well as I do that they don't build themselves, and they weren't wearing any insignia. What were they doing in Seer? And then there's the storm ship. Someone had devoted a tremendous amount of resources to protect that area. What was going on there? Lay looked away.
You're thinking of Whitehearth, aren't you?
Can you blame me? Lay sighed and shook her head. They had reached the lift. Surprisingly, it was empty.
I know. You've got no reason to trust my... House Cannith. But I refuse to believe that my parents had anything to do with this.
What did they do during the war?
They spent most of their lives working on the Warforged. They worked with Aaron Decanith on the first true Warforged 31 years ago. It's a long story, but we weren't that close at the end. It's my fault, I suppose.
What was it the Sphinx said? You must forget your house and focus on your family? Lay nodded thoughtfully. They stopped at the next district, and a patrol of the watch came aboard.
You're right. But how could I...
Well. The harsh voice came from behind them. ringing out as the lift began to descend. Dane turned. There were 4 halberdiers blocking the gate of the lift. Standing before them was a dwarf, Sergeant Lorak, whom Dane had thrown off a lift. This lift. "Looking to get to the ground, boy," the dwarf said. "I know a faster way."